All right, good evening, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back to another weather update. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This update is going to be in regards to what is now Hurricane Milton. As of the time of this video, it is currently a Category 1 hurricane, but honestly, that threshold will not last long, as we are anticipating that once this does move off towards the east-northeast at a very rapid pace here in the next 24 hours, we will then see it undergo some rapid intensification. Now, this is the latest satellite from Hurricane Milton, and as you can see, one of those signatures we always look for when it comes to tropical development is that deep convection near the center, and we certainly see that here. Take a look at the IR loop. You're starting to see, some pink colors and some white, so that brightness by our infrared satellite is telling us that we have a lot of that deep convection near the center. So, as we just established, therefore, we can already conclude just off this one product that we are seeing a very healthy system right now of Hurricane Milton. Now, yesterday, we did see quite a bit of weakening out towards the northern flank of the system, but that was likely due to some dry air that was ingested. These systems that are relatively small in terms of their spatial scale, they tend to absorb more dry air than a system that's larger. So a lot of that has to do with the dynamics that are involved with tropical weather and tropical systems. But what we do expect is, as the system does eventually progress off towards east-northeast, will we see a little bit more of an increase in the spatial scale of this storm, what we call spatial temporal scales, right? So temporal, we're talking about time frames. Spatial, we're talking about the spatial scale of which this storm exists in. So overall and all in all, a lot of what we talked about yesterday is pretty much applicable now. So if you want a little bit more of a dissecting of the conditions downstream of the system, I highly suggest you check out yesterday's video, because a lot of that is still relevant today. What this video is going to do is just break down sort of the nowcasting, what's happening now as we've started to do so far, and then also show you some of the model guidance with the system itself. One of the things we did establish yesterday is that this system is going to be taking on a pretty, I would say, respectable track. And what I mean by that is, usually a few days out, sometimes, actually more times than not, do we see tropical systems sort of wobble a bit, and you have sort of this cone of uncertainty which the NHC has here outputted. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. But the main driver here of this system is that we have this easterly flow that is essentially moving across the Bay of Campeche and essentially the gap here between the Caribbean and the Yucatan. This system, though, originated from a weak cluster of showers and thunderstorms that were located right around the 20th north latitude line in central Mexico. Now, there was a lot of uncertainty with that at the time a couple days ago as far as how that would survive, because as you move over land, you have to deal with friction. There's really rough terrain in this area. We got some topography we're talking about in terms of those mountain ranges. So there's a lot of uncertainty with that once it moved into essentially the Bay of Campeche. Now that it has, we have seen this really slow down and develop into what is now a hurricane. Now, as this storm progresses, what we're expecting to be the catalyst behind that is this broad cold front. I should draw this here in blue. This broad cold front that currently is situated right near the Gulf. And let me correct myself there. It's not in the Gulf yet. As a matter of fact, if I was to draw the cold front, it's going to be off the page towards the northern half of the United States. But this cold front itself will eventually make its way down towards these Gulf Coast states by the time we get to right around that, I would even say Tuesday, Wednesday time frame. And this storm, because of that, that's not going to want to go towards the cold front, because as we know, these frontal boundaries have a lot of shear. And unlike tornadoes, hurricanes do not like shear. It actually inhibits the development of the system itself. And so this hurricane is going to have a tendency to want to stay away from that. So, as you can tell by this cone of uncertainty, especially if we're looking towards Florida, there really isn't much wiggle room here. I mean, if anything, it may wobble a little bit to the north of Tampa Bay. We could even see it, the eye wall, make landfall to the south of Tampa Bay. But for the most part, unlike the systems we've seen with Helene and what we saw with Beryl, there really isn't much wiggle room here because of that cold front that's going to be situated pretty much right across those Gulf Coast states by the time we do get to landfall. Now, what does that mean in terms of the magnitude of the storm at landfall? Well, I will tell you this. Let's start first with this map by the NHC. We are forecasting and, of course, in agreement with the National Hurricane Center on this becoming a major hurricane as soon as tonight, if not tomorrow morning. A pretty quick turnaround here, as it is currently undergoing rapid intensification as we speak. There are some model solutions, which you'll see here in just a bit, that are pointing at potentially a Cat 4 to even a Category 5 out here towards between the 20th and the 25th north latitude. So right within, you would call it just off the coast of the Yucatan, which is why we do have this hurricane watches out for the Yucatan as well as Cancun for that very reason. And so because of that, we are expecting this to become a major hurricane. I mean, it's pretty much a high probability at this point. The question, though, becomes what will be of Hurricane Milton by the time it gets to the west coast of central Florida. Remember that the big talking point here has been that cold front. It's still going to be within the vicinity of the cold front, and that means it's going to encounter quite a bit of shear once it does make that east-northeast turn. And as it does so, it's not going to remain a Category 5. The likelihood of that is very low. I know there's some forecasters out there that are hypothetically going for that bullish forecast. I'm not going to, because realistically speaking, we will likely see a weakening tendency as this gets closer to Florida because it is starting to interact with shear in a little bit more of an unfavorable environment. That being said, the most critical piece of this forecast is truly how strong it gets out in the central Gulf of Mexico. Because if we're talking about a system that is anywhere between, say, and I'll even write this here, say 910 to a 920 millibar system, well, you're going to see on a lot of our model output that when that weakens, you're still talking about a 950 to a 955 millibar storm. In translation, even if this storm was to weaken from, let's say, a Category 4, it's still going to be flirting with a Cat 2, Cat 3 status once it makes landfall. So when we say weakening, I certainly don't want to imply that we're going to be seeing more of a tropical storm landfall as opposed to a hurricane. That's likely not going to be the case. We are at about an 80 to 90% probability that this storm will make landfall as a major hurricane in some way or fashion as it gets towards Florida. So what I want to show you now, before we do dive into some of those model outputs, I want to show you first the aircraft reconnaissance missions that have just went through. And just like what we did with Helene, keep in mind that these discussions are as of about, call it 5 p.m. Central Time. So expect that this will likely decay, this forecast of ours will decay throughout the night and into tomorrow morning. I will be posting another update tomorrow morning, but we're going to do about 2 updates per day. If you have any questions between now and then, obviously shoot me a message here on the Discord channel. But in the case of our 5 p.m. Outlook update, let's take a look at the NOAA 3 mission that just is en route. So we're not going to look at that because that's happening as we speak. Let's go back to one that occurred earlier on today. This would have been just within the last couple hours or so. And as you can see, we had quite a few cuts across this system. And let's take a look first at the pressure measurement. And this was from the reconnaissance mission. Like I said, it's not a NOAA-based mission. I think it's the Air Force that we were looking at. And as you can see, it did measure about a 983 millibar center, which would, of course, be indicative of a hurricane when you're talking about pressures within the 980 level and even, 970s, etc. And also, if we look here at dropson, we've looked at this quite a bit before. As you can see, a little bit of some dry air intrusion towards the bottom part as well as the middle. Remember, the green line here is our dew point, the red is our temperature. And other than that, though, it's a relatively healthy system. I mean, we're not talking about a lot of dry air to where we're seeing weakening. It's just not completely saturated. So there's a little bit of dry air intrusion, but it's not really having much of a significant impact, as you can tell based on what we're seeing with relative humidity. Still within that 80 to 83% relative humidity range, which is relatively saturated, I would say. So that is from the latest reconnaissance missions. And by the way, I would argue that the pressure that was measured here right around that 20 UTC time, which would have taken us just about 3 o'clock p.m. Central Time, that This is likely lower than that. I suspect that this system in Hurricane Milton, the pressure itself is probably now below 980 at this point. So take this with a grain of salt. Again, our forecast will decay here over the next few hours, especially as the storm does rapidly intensify. But just keep in mind, we're definitely seeing significant pressure drops from reconnaissance mission to reconnaissance mission here just in the last few hours. So last thing that I will show you guys here, and actually a couple more things. We'll show you first the magnitude model output for what we're seeing with Milton. Look at this, guys. I mean, we have seen a rapid uptrend in our model guidance for severity. This would put Milton anywhere between a Cat 4 to a Cat 5 system by the time we get to that 36-hour to even 60-hour window. So that would put us right about Tuesday before this makes landfall. And beyond that point, it's really anybody's guess. I mean, the spread does show a significant drop-off in magnitude by the time this makes landfall, as you can see by our model spread. But the thing to take away is that even at landfall, we could be talking about anywhere between a Cat 3 and a Cat 4, which is why the National Hurricane Center has stuck with that major hurricane threshold once it makes landfall, that M tag that we saw on the cone of uncertainty, because look at our model spread. By the time we get to that Wednesday period, around Wednesday morning-ish, you see a vast majority of those model members, of course, stepping down from that Cat 4, Cat 5 threshold, but still within Category 3 range. Now, the major concern that exists today is where exactly this is going to make landfall. Here is the latest ensemble spread, at least looking at the GEFS and the 20-some different members of that model. You can see that the spread is still pretty wide. I did mention that the cone is narrow itself in terms of just west central Florida impacts. I guess what I mean by the pathing in this case is whether or not we'll see a direct impact to Tampa St. Pete. That, to me as a forecaster, is the utmost concern. That's not to say that other areas aren't important, like areas to the south of Tampa St. Pete, places like Fort Myers and Bradenton, etc. But the important thing to note here is that Tampa Bay has that bowl effect, right? We're talking about a bay. We have a lot of property there, and it's also a highly populated density area. So if we were to get direct storm surge from, say, an eye wall that moved essentially just to the north, and it's hard to see here, but just to the north of Tampa Bay, we could be talking about anywhere between 10 to 20 foot storm surge plus. I mean, easily. And that's not even factoring in the 12 plus inch rainfall we're talking about. Remember, though, that storm surge, when it moves into the bay, especially with winds that are coming out of essentially the south and southwest, that's going to actually amplify your storm surge because it's going to be forced into that bay, and then it's going to want to rush forward. So it really amplifies the severity of storm surge. And so Tampa Bay, for those of you that don't know or may know, is one of the most vulnerable cities to hurricanes aside from Houston. It's actually the most vulnerable city in terms of catastrophic losses. So if we were having a conversation about insurance, which I happen to be in that industry, that's certainly a concern there about how much this will cost. It's certainly a concern to FEMA and all the other political entities, insurance entities. But I think there's also an impact to the energy nat gas space. I think there can be many storylines out of that depending on the severity of the system, which I would argue today, again, is likely going to be a major, whether it hits Tampa Bay directly or not. So, this in mind, let's take one last look and just dive into some of these models as they're running right now. We'll start first with the GFS, and I don't think that's going to go out far enough for us, but it does take that northeast turn, as you can see pretty clearly there. Watch what happens when we get from Tuesday to Wednesday. Excuse me. You see more of a sharp northeast turn towards that Tampa St. Pete area. Let's actually go back here. I want to see it, 18Z as the time of this video, it's running right now. So let's look at the 12Z run. This is from one of our hurricane models, the H-Wharf. It's a pretty reliable model as part of our hurricane suite. You can see that over central Mexico, by the time we get to Tuesday afternoon and evening, 928 millibar system. That is flirting between a Cat 4 to Cat 5 at that point. And as that moves off towards the east and northeast, eventually it does pretty much brush right up against Tampa St. Pete. This is an absolute worst case scenario. that is playing out here on some of those hurricane models. But as you can see, we go from a 928 to a 943. We are likely to see this system certainly begin to weaken once it hits some of that shear along that cold front, but it's still going to be a major hurricane, as we talked about. So clearly being shown here on some of those hurricane models. We'll take a look at one more here just for the sake of conversation, and we'll look at the HAFS A. And you will see it's a lot more bullish with the strength of this. It pretty much wants a Category 5 to the north of the Yucatan as soon as Tuesday morning. And then once that eventually moves off towards the east and northeast, getting towards Tampa, look at that. It has a pressure right around that 956 range. So general consensus for our models is anywhere between a 940 millibar to about a 956 millibar system, which in terms of winds is going to be pretty strong. I mean, we're talking about definitely sustained winds north of at least 110 miles per hour, and that is very much concerning. If we were to plot that, by the way, let's take a look here at some of those winds now, and we'll look at the 10-meter wind. So this is just above the surface, and as you can see, right, look at your strongest winds here moving through Tampa Bay, right? That's pretty concerning. And again, this is in terms of knots, so we would be talking about 64 knots. Sustained winds would definitely be pretty intense at that point. Anywhere between 80 to 90 knots plus, we're definitely talking about 110 to even 120 miles per hour. That would impact the Tampa-St. Pete area, and then areas, of course, to the north and to the south of that. So a lot of concern with impacts, of course, and a lot of implications in many different industries, as we've sort of highlighted. So I will be posting a couple more products throughout the day today, and I'm going to actually use the same package that I use. It's called Tropical. It's a coding package. I'll throw together some updates here on the forecast, and we'll do another update tomorrow morning, and then we'll have an additional one towards the evening. And as I mentioned before, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, post those in the Discord between now and then, and I am happy to answer those throughout the day tomorrow, and of course going into tonight and the rest of the week. Thank you so much for tuning in as always, and we will see you on the next weather discussion.